Yeah. Right, well, welcome everyone to the Executive Member for Transport decision session on 14th of February 2022. We have a number of speakers registered, which I'll come to shortly. First item is declarations of interest, and I should also just say in relation to the declaration of interest, which I'm going to make, is item 4. Item 4 relates to Broadway West residents parking, which is the street I live on, and therefore I will be handing that decision, responsibility for that decision, to Councillor Widdowson, which is why she's sat next to me. So that's my declaration of interest, is being a resident at Broadway West, although I don't have a car, but that's just from the point of view of transparency, to make it clear I'm not influencing that decision. And the second item, do you have any declarations to make in relation to Broadway West? No. Okay, thank you. So the second item is the minutes of the meeting on 16th of November and the 18th of January, which I have in front of me, and I'm happy to sign those as a true record of the meetings of those respective meetings. So that's that one. Those, thank you. Which takes me to public participation, and each of the speakers has up to 3 minutes, although as I'll explain when I come to it, there are a couple of speakers, because we have a limit of a maximum of 10 for the meetings, who agreed to share their time, but one of those 3 hasn't arrived as yet, so we'll see how we go when we get to that point. I'm also aware that currently in the room there are 2 there are 2 speakers who are due to be in the room for this meeting, are not here at this moment in time. So if they appear at a later stage before we've concluded public speakers, I'll come back to them. So that's Councillor Waters on the general remit, and also Councillor Melly on general remit of the. Right, okay. Can you follow that up, and we'll perhaps come back to that. Thank you for that. So that moves me on to speakers on item 7, and as I explained, I sort of tried to ensure that we were as inclusive as possible in terms of people who registered to speak. Mr. Ian Mitchell is on the list and hopefully going to be phoning in, registered a little bit late. So I spoke to Tony May and Roger Pierce and asked them if they could shave a little bit of time off their speeches. So the first speaker I have on this item, which is item 7 regarding pedestrian signals, is Tony May. And to come up and say, I did say 2 minutes, but if you go over a little bit, I'll be generous on that. One says Mick.
I'm not pushing hard enough. I must get stronger. Thank you, Chair, and I'll do my best to keep within 2 minutes. I'm speaking, as you said, about item 7 on behalf of the York Civic Trust. The report which you have before you contains several comments which struck me might possibly be misleading. So in my position as a traffic engineer, I thought I might say a few words about them. First of all, the government doesn't require uniformity in the type of pedestrian signal used at all installations. What it asks for is a policy setting out which types of crossing are to be provided and in what circumstances and why. It then asks for consistency in applying that policy. And it seems to me, therefore, that reason 1 for the recommendation is potentially incompatible with government advice. Secondly, the report appears to me to treat signalized crossings and pedestrian signals at junctions as identical. And as I'll try to argue, they're not. The needs are very different. For signalized crossings away from a junction, those with far-sided signals do not need to be pelicans. There is the new provision of so-called PEDX signals, which allow for on-crossing detection and variable crossing times. And therefore, it seems to me that crossings with far-side signals do not need to be inferior to puffing crossings. Neither do they need, as the report suggests, to be a source of ambiguity. And on that basis, reason 4 for the recommendation is, I think, invalid. Our preference is for PEDX signals rather than puffins, and I'm happy to elaborate on that. But our main concern is with signalized junctions. The lack of pavement space near junctions, particularly in inner York, makes it very difficult for pedestrians to see the near side signal. And I've submitted 2 photographs of station rise approaching from the station, in each of which the majority of pedestrians cannot see the signal. And there's a real danger that if somebody who can see the signal decides to cross on red, others will follow, not realizing that there is a danger. Also, they cannot, in most cases, face the oncoming traffic because it's typically coming from behind them at that junction.
If you could wind up your comments.
Sorry.
If you could wind up your comments.
Yes, of course. In those circumstances, the use of near side signals is, we argue, potentially extremely unsafe. If far side signals are used, then at least pedestrians can see them as they stand at the curb and as they start to cross. And what we'd like to recommend is that you ask for a modification of this report, which actually treats crossings away from junctions and crossings at junctions as separate and argues the case for what the council is going to propose for each.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Roger Pierce, who I believe is on behalf of, is it Walk York? Thank you.
My new logo. Yeah, good afternoon, Councillor De Goyne. Walk York recognises, first of all, the skills and technical knowledge that have been exercised by the council's officers in the ZAR programme. Well done, and thank you. However, it rapidly became apparent following the first lights that members of the public, and indeed all my ward councillors, were unhappy with the loss of far-side pedestrian indicator lights. Therefore, last year, members of Walk York were asked, and in an entirely unbiased way, there's no point sort of assaulting the mind, to express their support or otherwise for the new near-side pedestrian indicator lights. They were overwhelmingly critical of near-side lights. They preferred far-side ones. In their experience, near-side lights, both the upper ones and the lower ones, where 2 were used, were frequently concealed from view by people clustering around the control unit. Partially sighted members in particular found that this clustering prevented them from reaching the rotating indicator cone on the underside of the control unit. They could only do so in practice after the other pedestrians had left and were therefore anxious as they crossed the road. Our members preferred far-side lights because they are more readily visible to all. They showed the way to walk in complex junctions and provide reassurance halfway across that they were safe as they continued. This feeling was shared by 47% of the general public responding to the council's questionnaire, which, contrary to the implication in the report, was twice greater than the people preferring near-side lights, because there was a sizable portion of people who didn't know, probably didn't understand the question, actually, in fairness. Walk York, therefore, supports Tony May's recommendations. Is Ian Martin to speak this afternoon? So is he going to speak? Can I just in 30 seconds say what he's going to say, because he sent me a draft. First of all, Ian Martin is the Northeastern officer for the national charity that deals with, represents blind people. He says he's blind, but like a lot of blind people, he can actually see. and he can see the far side light. What he can't see when people are clustered around it is the near side light, or use the indicator knob. And he describes the instance he had last week waiting in a large crowd when the group in front of him moved off. He moved off and found himself in front of a vehicle. And that was because the people in front of the lights who were screening the control unit were actually dashing for a gap in the traffic. So this is his concern, that it can be hazardous for blind people. Obviously, he can amplify that as and when he concerns. So he also shares turning-based technical recommendations to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll move on to the next speaker. Well, in fact, the next speaker was due to be in Mitchell, but it seems like we don't need to have that contribution. We've had a summary of that just now. So the speaker after that via telephone is David Skaith. Also wishes to speak on this topic, I believe. Do we have David on the line?
Hello.
Hello, we can hear you. Do you want to say your 3 minutes worth?
Yes, thank you. Cheers.
Yeah.
My point is actually more about a specific junction. It's the junction of Warmgate Bar where Lawrence Street and Foss Island all meet. You have traffic coming from 4 different directions, and I believe you have 5 different pedestrian crossings. It's a particularly busy junction, and you have, if you're coming away from town, you have traffic coming from your left, from your right, from behind you, and in front of you if you are a pedestrian. Without having the far-sided light, that junction is very often very busy. And as several speakers have already said, people can actually stand and block the pedestrian crossing signal on the near side. Therefore, not having the far-sided signal can put a lot of people not knowing the correct time to cross. If that is blocked on the near side, then people particularly can't see where the traffic is coming from. If someone was to, and I do see on a regular basis, this is why I point this particular junction out, because this is where I come into work every day, people do quite often just cross when they think it's safe. And because people can't see the near side light and there's no far side, a lot of the times people tend to follow. Because traffic can come from behind and from a blind side, this could cause, obviously, a really big problem going forward. I do believe that certain junctions throughout York would be absolutely fine not having a far side light. For example, down Bootham, where you maybe have traffic only coming from the left and the right in a very controlled manner, that's probably fine because people can easily see where the traffic's coming from. But a more complex junction such as this one, where traffic can come in 4 different directions, I think it's paramount that we have far-sided and near-sided light. As also one of the speakers has already mentioned, the sheer nature of York having very small pavements means that people can get very heavily congregated around the traffic light system on the near side. Thus, if there's more than 2 or 3, 4 people at that junction, it can be very hard to see any kind of lights. So I believe that maybe not every junction in York needs to have far and near-sided, but I certainly think a plan going through the more complex junctions of York, having near and far-sided, should be implemented. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your contributions, which we noted when we come to that item. I believe I have Councillor Melly next on the line. Is Councillor Melly there?
Hi, good afternoon.
Hello. Do you want to start when you're ready?
Great, thank you. Yes, I'd like to speak on a couple of agenda items, please. On agenda item 8, active travel schemes, I will obviously mention the Acombe Road scheme, as I have done several times now at these decision sessions. I won't spend too much time on it, though, because other speakers are going to cover this scandal in detail, but I would like to add my voice to the chorus of outcry. Paragraph 15 of the report says that you met with ward councillors to discuss the scope of the project outline. Although you did meet with Holgate and Acombe ward councillors, thank you for that, less than 2 weeks before this report was published, you gave no indication of the scope of this scheme as it's now presented. In fact, you presented us with something completely different. Although I've asked you in public participation to keep ward councillors fully involved, you didn't inform us of this drastic cut to a crucial scheme in our wards that I've called on you to prioritise, not decimate. Better walking and cycling infrastructure to and through Acombe High Street is greatly needed and has public support, as well as the support of Acombe and Holgate councillors. No reasons whatsoever have been provided in the report or anywhere for not including it in the active travel programme as planned. Kicking the scheme into the so-called Acomb regeneration scheme is a cop-out. It has no funding, no plan, no scope, no anything. It doesn't exist. Ditching this scheme from the active travel programme where it belongs in the hope that it might form part of a scheme that doesn't exist means either kicking the can way, way down the road or risking it never happening at all. Either way, you need to give it higher priority, please. Please consider approving the full scheme as has been funded, as has been promised, as is needed, as has public support. There's no shame in doing a U-turn, and you would have my full backing. On the active travel programme more generally, the project prioritisation list is helpful to have, but there's no information about how the schemes are prioritised. The only information that it came from engagement with you, and this isn't very transparent decision making. There's no explanation or information provided about how some schemes are prioritised over others, and local residents would like to know, please. So if you could cover that when you get to that agenda item. On agenda item 7, I found the report surprising. Far side signals are hugely preferred to near side, according to every survey on the subject. So it seems strange that you would approve plans for all crossing signals to be near side only. People tend to look forward, not to their side. Signals at 1.2 metre high are almost always obstructed and therefore ineffective because people stand next to them to press the button and then wait there to cross, meaning that no one can see the signal. The main reason for implementing this strange decision seems to be consistency, so people know what to expect when they use a signalised crossing. But people tend to use the same crossings habitually, and people are familiar with far side crossings and know how to use them. No one's going to be bewildered by them. So why continue to implement near side when you know that isn't what the people of York want? If you really are going to approve this, then you need to stipulate that there will always be a signal at 1.7 metres and there will always be an audio signal as well. Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution, which we'll note when we come to that item. Next speaker I have is Rob Ainsley on the active travel programme. Do you want to come to the table?
Can you hear me now? Excellent. York Cycle Campaign. We're appalled to see the Acomb Road cycle scheme reduced from 1.5 miles to just over half a mile. There's no good reason for this reduction. The section removed is the one most dangerous for cyclists. Active travel schemes benefit everybody. They free up the road for those who need it by encouraging short journeys to be made by bike, on foot and so on. But to do that, they need to be joined up routes with safe provision throughout. Piecemeal segmentation just doesn't work. That won't enable people to cycle journeys that they'd normally drive. Now, as you know, the funding for the Acomb scheme came from the Emergency Active Travel Fund. That was explicit. It was very clear about reallocating road space in order to enable safe walking and cycling. Now, Active Travel England, which, as you know, a government executive agency, they've got power, responsible for improving the standards of cycling and walking infrastructure in England. They will expect to see the funding to have been used properly, to have been used in that way, following LTN guidelines, LTN 120. Not doing this risks the funding being clawed back, and that could jeopardise future funding for similar schemes. Now, Active Travel England, as you know, they'll be based in York this year. They're not going to let the scheme pass in this half-baked form. I mean, the original proposal didn't exactly set the bar high. That will not go unnoticed by the press. I don't mean the York press, I mean the national press. And it's not going to go unnoticed by the vast majority of people in York who just want to get around their city quickly, efficiently, actively. People like me who don't want to be stuck in or contribute to traffic. Now, all the reasons for this 1.5 mile stretch of road originally being proposed are still valid. It would provide a continuous and safe link to villages, Knapton, Poppleton, Rufforth. It would enable hundreds of children to cycle to school safely. It would provide hundreds of people with an alternative to driving, visiting the library, swimming pool, doctor's surgery, shops, whatever. It's got the potential to bring about a huge rise in cycle commuting and cycle journeys. Research done by the propensity to cycle tool shows that people want to cycle. There's a big demand there, a big latent demand. Rates could quadruple with good infrastructure. 40% of residents, 40% cycling to work, 40% of children cycling to school.
30 seconds.
If we have the infrastructure. So the current recommendation to split the scheme and only complete a short section using the active travel function means it's no longer the scheme that was originally funded. That risks active travel funding being clawed back and a reduction in the amount of funding you'll get in the future. We want to see the Acomb Road Cycle Scheme revert to the original 1.5 mile scheme that was bid for. Complete it in 2 phases if necessary, but it's all got to be funded from the active travel fund and treated as a very high priority scheme. Thank you.
Next speaker I have on my list is Councillor Lomas, also on this item, I believe.
Thank you, Chair. I represent residents living in Acomb Ward who would dearly love to use this route for active travel. Residents need to get to schools, shops, services, leisure and work in Acomb and beyond. Stopping the scheme on the Holgate side of the shops offers no benefit at all for those living in Acomb Ward, as the most difficult and dangerous sections of the route alongside Acomb Green and behind the shops on Front Street is being left as it is. This project was very exciting as it was first presented, offering as it did a properly joined up approach to active travel along a route that has significant challenges for cycling and pedestrians, and in an area of the city where rates of cycling are low. I've never been consulted on the detail of the scheme. We did have a briefing where I was asked about the route, the full route, all the way, where you, Councillor de Gorn, said to me that the Acomb Green section of the scheme might be the section that is done last due to the complexity. That is understandable and expected that such a scheme would be completed in sections to minimise disruption of the works. It was never, however, suggested that the Acomb section of the scheme would be abandoned completely, and that's outrageous. I would love to know more about the mythical Acomb regeneration that is being referred to. We've been waiting years to find out how the Acomb share of the £50,000 that was to Haxby and our area would be spent. I'm not sure how half of that sum would enable active travel though, so perhaps you can explain that to us all further. Or is there another Acomb regeneration planned that Acomb Ward councillors just haven't been informed about? Who can say? Councillor de Gorn, please do not ditch 2/3 of this scheme just because colleagues in Westfield have objected to it. The stretch beyond Holgate is the boundary between Westfield and Acomb wards, and our residents deserve better. It's not good enough anymore to leave Acomb behind or put it in the too difficult pile. We, residents of Acomb, need this full scheme to support active travel in and beyond our wards. Thank you.
Next speaker I have registered is Councillor Waller, also on this item.
Thank you, Executive Member. Westfield Ward councillors responded to the initial consultation on active travel in June 2020 with a comprehensive local report on cycling and walking issues within the ward, compiling many comments that residents have made to us over recent years. For the avoidance of doubt, we are not opposed to the consideration of the implementation of a cycle lane as described, but there has to be full public engagement. We would also appreciate the promised neighbourhood working for highways issues, which will help to make safe cycle margins right across the ward and tackling many other issues which deter people from cycling or walking. I cycle virtually every day in the ward. We believe that all schemes across the whole ward should be considered and that there should be inclusive consultation. We are asking that a commitment is made to meaningfully engage with residents, businesses and schools. There are 2 schools mentioned in this report, but I'm very disappointed that York High School and Westfield Primary Schools have not been engaged with for the active travel programme. I will not stand by and let them be excluded. I hope that all schools in the area will be included. We are also asking about the mitigating measures that will be put in place to keep the police station running and businesses functioning in the area, including the Front Street regeneration and any knock-on effects in surrounding streets. That has to be considered as a whole. We regret that there had not been engagement with local ward councillors by officers before the 25th of January 2022 on how the proposals would be worked through. Having seen what has been put upon Dringhouses and Woodthorpe councillors with regard to the public engagement over the Tadcaster Road scheme, we naturally wanted to know more details about how the proposals for surface improvements, delivery schemes and public realm improvements in Front Street would work in partnership with the cycle lane. Having, as I mentioned, cycled around the area, I'm very interested to hear that there have been discussions about routing the cycle lane along the south side of Acomb Green. The topography doesn't work for that. So with much time having elapsed since the start of the process in 2020, we're surprised that the report did not contain greater detail in how issues would be tackled to deliver a successful scheme and the processes for public engagement. I hope that in general, there will be ongoing engagement with ward councillors, and other ward councillors have asked for the same, so that there is a process by which we can work together. Thank you.
Thank you for your contributions. The next speaker I have also on this item is Christian Gregory on the telephone. Yeah. Can you hear us, Christian?
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Hi, yes, thank you. Do you want to give us your contribution?
Will do. So I'm Christian, I'm a resident of Severus Avenue and also a ward representative for York Cycling Campaign. Severus Avenue is directly adjacent to Acomb Road, so I was delighted when I first heard the council secured funding for an active travel scheme in my area. I was looking forward to inspecting the designs due last month and imagining how getting around might be improved for myself and the benefits it might bring to the community here. So you can hopefully understand then why it is so disappointing to see the plans have been dramatically reduced, the timetable for delivery abandoned, and no reason given for this sudden change. In order to deliver this route, many residents in this area who live along Acomb Road are going to be asked to put up with disruption from roadworks and changes to parking arrangements. In return for this, they should be seeing the full benefits of the scheme. The main benefit should be that they can now cycle in safety and comfort to any of the places in the area they want to be, whether that's taking their kids to school or visiting businesses along the route, such as Tea on the Green and the Crooked Tap. However, in its truncated form, this project fails to get people all the way to their destination in safety. It leaves gaps at some of the most dangerous parts of the journey, such as the roundabout by Oak Rise. And the project could be transformative, but piecemeal segments of cycle infrastructure will not encourage those who don't cycle already and won't enable people to cycle for journeys that they might normally drive. There are other benefits residents should be able to enjoy after the work, such as quieter streets and cleaner air. However, it will be hard to see a noticeable improvement if the project doesn't do enough to persuade people to switch from driving to cycling. Ultimately, people will not find it fair that they put up with disruption for a disconnected section of cycle infrastructure. While I understand the council's position is that they feel they can proceed more quickly with a truncated scheme, such a move stores up problems for the future. The UK government has landed on a strategy for delivering active travel that centres on allocating funding only to local authorities who provide plans for ambitious, high-quality schemes. In time, that funding will also depend upon the track record in delivering on those commitments. If this council demonstrates at this early stage that it can't deliver on its plans in full, it will seriously hinder York's ability to secure funding in the future. My concern is that by deferring a significant portion of this route to the Acomb Regeneration Project, which will have different goals, funding and scope, the UK government, through its agency Active Travel England, will look at this as a failure to deliver what it promised and be reluctant to provide funding to future schemes. So while I wouldn't object to the scheme being implemented in multiple phases, I am today asking the committee to reject the proposal to truncate the scheme. This is so the scheme can be designed in a full and ultimately delivered so as to meet the conditions of the original proposal. I believe this will mean a first phase can commence immediately while securing the full route, protecting York's reputation in the eyes of Active Travel England, and not leaving the community with half a cycle lane. Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution. And finally, the last speaker I have registered is Councillor Callum Taylor. Can you hear us, Callum?
Good afternoon, councillors are gone. Yes.
Yeah, do you want to say your contribution?
Yeah, will do. Right. There's been a lot said on this already in other fora, but for the record, I want to express my alienation with how the council have so far gone about what was meant to be the York Road and Acomb Road active travel scheme. As ward councillors, we've been chasing for information on this for well over a year. For a change, we were actually excited by something the council wanted to do. Over most of this time, we've had either silence or delay, but our hopes were raised in January when you met with us and walked through what the hoped for scheme would look like, from Beckfield Lane all the way down to the lights by the Fox. And you asked us to flag up any issues which would need bearing in mind for the consultation. We left that meeting under the impression that today we'd be looking at a paper seeking to give the go-ahead for a consultation on that. So to then learn earlier this month that the scheme had been cut by nearly 2/3 was surprising and gutting. When trying to find out the reasons for this, councillors and residents have been gaslighted or given a vague suggestion. The input of Liberal Democrat councillors in Westfield led to this sudden reduction. Incidentally, an utterly bizarre email shared this morning from Councillor Andrew Waller to the York Cycle campaign suggests that this is actually what's gone on. Why have councillors from one ward got the power to critically cut back something which more councillors from two equally relevant wards support before it's even gone out to consultation? It would be a grubby disservice to residents if this was the end of the conversation, Councillor de Gorn. And so this afternoon, you've got two options. The first is to keep your head down, do as Councillor Waller tells you, and sign off the much reduced remaining scheme. Some cycle lanes are better than none, but the attraction of the initial scheme was its length, which would create a huge active travel gain. Of course, this option, though, amounts to letting Liberal Democrat councillors wreck the initial scheme from behind the scenes before residents in Westfield, Acomb and Holgate have had a chance to see it for themselves. The second option you have is to do what you know is the right thing to do, Andy, and allow the initial plan with its whole length from Beckfield Lane that we've been expecting to go out to consultation. This will allow a well-rounded open assessment from residents, addressing Councillor Waller's concerns, if they're genuine, on how to make it work as well as it can. It will also show that the council and you are serious about maximising active travel gains. Thank you, in a part of the city that needs them. Whatever you decide will say a lot about your politics, Councillor de Gorn, and whether you want your coalition partners to finally take you seriously in your role. This is a key moment for you to show the difference that having a Green in power for transport can make. Put the original scheme in its full length out to consultation, and we will rightly applaud you for doing so. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for that. And I can assure you that wasn't a party political broadcast, so it might have sounded like it. If I can move on now, that concludes the speakers, which I have on these items, which takes me then to item 4, which relates to the residents parking for Broadway West. So at this point, I will I'll leave the meeting and hand over to.
Thank you, Andy. Can I just ask Dave and James just to turn your note plates 90 degrees? Notes towards the camera, not me. I know who you are. The way around. Oh, is it? It's fair enough. Mine isn't. It's okay. I've just had a couple of comments that people asking to see who the people were. Okay, so many thanks for our speakers. Andy is going to sit away from the table while we go through this agenda item. Dave, is it you two? Darren, do you want to introduce it and take me through it, please?
Hi. So the proposal is for the introduction of a residents parking scheme on Broadway West, initially brought to a decision session in February 2021, and the advertisement, statutory consultation, went out in April 2021 as well. We had 5 objections to the report, and then those have been considered within the outcomes. The recommendation is to take forward the scheme on Broadway West, removing any resident parking from Westfield Drive. There was a small section that went into that on the frontage of 2 properties, And then also proposing an extension to the scheme, taking numbers 298 and 314 on Fulford Road to give them access, as there's no parking currently from their properties. Is that clear?
That was clear, yes, I have read it as well. So there's been some flexibility from the objections so that people can actually park their cars, even though the ones on Fulford Road could come in round the back.
Yeah, so they give them the option to use the zone if they wish.
Well. And does that cover most of the objections or all of the objections that were raised?
Most of the objections. There was one objection that was a general objection to residents parking being taken forward across the city rather than just specific. They didn't want it on their street, but they were on Westfield Drive, which is not supposed to be included as well. So that section has been covered.
I thought it had when I was looking at it. I thought everything had been taken into account. Okay, so I've read the report. I understand the report. I'm quite happy to accept the recommendations. Okay.
So we move now on to the next item, which is item 5, update on e-scooter trials on page 23.
I'll do an introduction and then if Christian, if I get anything wrong, Christian, you jump in and correct me. So this has been a extremely successful trial we've had in York, which has been a trial of e-scooters and e-bikes, and it's probably worth, from an office perspective, just passing on our thanks to Tia, our provider, who've made it so, and plus the other partners who've been involved, so the hospitals, the universities and things like that, who've made this very successful. This paper is in response to the DFT's announcement that they were going to extend the trial to November. So in the first instance, we're asking for a decision to continue to the trial to 30th of November. Alongside that, we'll need to replace the experimental traffic regulation order with a permanent one to allow that trial to exist until November. And then there's a third decision around the nature of how we're going to roll out. So Tia, the provider, are minded to start to provide more e-bikes for longer journeys, particularly when we get to further out to the outskirts and to the villages. And this is about confirming that you are content with us using the existing cycle rack infrastructure for partially hosting some of the e-bikes.
Thank you. So there are several aspects to this decision, as you said. The reason Councillor Widdowson's staying here is that the initial decision to go ahead with the trial was a joint decision, although I have subsequently been advised that Democratic Services prefer a lead decision maker, but nevertheless it seemed to make sense to include Councillor Widdowson here in terms of any questions and comments on this proposal. So I don't know, do you have anything that you want to add or ask about?
I've got a couple of comments.
Okay.
First of all, this has been stupendously successful, not just a little bit. And I questioned, Christine, I think it was when I saw the report, I questioned some of the numbers because the numbers were even higher than I remember them being. So to get 20 at the peak, at the best month that we've had, to get 20,000 people commuting on e-bikes and scooters is phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. Really pleased to see it, really pleased to see the work that we've done with Sustrans so that we can use their ways as well. Great cooperation across the city, good consultation across the city. So that really shows, you know, how successful we can be when we put our mind to it. Because if we remember when it was put in front of the councillors, most of us sat on the fence as to whether it would or it wouldn't work. So, you know, between the two of us, we've managed to make it happen. And with all of your work, you have done a fantastic project on it. My understanding as well is that Tia won the London contract on the back of what they've done here. I've introduced them to colleagues up in Durham, and they're looking at putting e-bikes in Durham because the scooters would just not take the hill. So they're looking at doing that. And all in all, I think it's fantastic. One small concern is when there are more bikes, it's how we make sure that we do have enough cycle racks, because more often than not now, when I cycle into town, there's not enough spaces within the town ones. There's not enough up at Tesco either, but I can't get the manager to put any in. But that's my only slight concern, and it is really minor compared to everything else that has been done. So all I can say, gentlemen, because it is all gentlemen in the room, fantastic, well done.
I would like to add to that I think our working relationship with TIA has been excellent. They have, quite consistently provided regular reports to councillors, hold monthly briefings where they provide information, answer questions, discuss any concerns that we've got. So from a point of view of, although we did select one provider out of a number that expressed interest, I think we made the right choice in terms of a provider that is very professional in their approach and does hold their hand up if there are things that are not right and are prepared to try and address them. If residents, as was mentioned in the report, in December, I think they launched an online opportunity for residents to respond to any concerns, to pinpoint where there are problems caused by the scheme, to try and help them to address those. And I also think that the way in which they've very gradually rolled it out the scheme, in spite of COVID and all the sort of chopping and changing that's happened in terms of their customer base, they have managed that well. They have gradually progressed from e-scooters to e-bikes, and then onto a wider geographical location, and negotiating with us the siting of the location of the docking points, or the parking points, should I say. So overall, I'm very much welcome this report, and can see no problems with approving the recommendations, which, as you said, the first one of those is to allow TIA to continue as a sole operator until 30th of November this year. And obviously that would be subject to further conversations and discussion as and when the government makes the decision on the longer legislation. But in the short term also, we need to, and presumably other authorities around the country will have to do the same thing, actually, having reached the end of the 18-month period, confirm a permanent TRO, traffic regulation order, which identifies these vehicles as an appropriate type of vehicle that is allowed to use cycling infrastructure. That would be my understanding of that TRO. So I don't know if you want to comment on that.
I'll probably bring Darren and Christian in, but yes, that's the case. So originally, this experiment by government, so just to put this in context, government said we want to run an experiment. They asked councils to nominate themselves for this experiment, and we used experimental TROs. The slight irony that the experiment is running longer than the legislation allows an experimental traffic regulation order to run for probably isn't lost on you, but that doesn't stop you from reverting any permanent changes, my understanding, at the end of the experiment.
Okay, so yes, so that's clear what's proposed there. And then the third aspect is to allow the use of certain selected, and obviously I think, as taking on board Councillor Wilson's point, that TIA have indicated that they would like to have a set number allowed to at any particular parking point. So, presumably if there's a rack of 6 or 8 stands, there would be 1 or 2 which could be used by e-bikes. But I do think we need, as has been said, we do need to monitor quite closely, and if is already significant pressure on parking spaces there, to look to see whether we can increase the number of racks to cater for that increased demand. But the principle would be to agree that that is something which will be negotiated on a case-by-case basis, so that any feedback from more councillors or residents could be taken into account.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have anything.
That would be the intent, to consult on a case-by-case basis, as we've been doing with the parking spots. Yeah.
And just to finally, to pick up on Councillor Wisdom's point about the success of this scheme, I think, although I have to confess, I was certainly amongst the sceptical councillors when this was first suggested. I think the fact that it is starting to change people's attitudes towards transport and identify that something which is a flexible service, in effect, can be and provide an alternative to either personally owned cycle or e-scooter, which obviously isn't legal at the moment on the public highway, but can provide that alternative mode of transport, which may mean that they don't need to make so many car journeys, or they can actually give up car journeys altogether. So obviously that is the main motivation from me as a point of view of the transport, promoting sustainable transport through this mechanism, but having in place all the safeguards so that where there are issues, they can be picked up on. And also, I suppose we should also put on record our thanks to TIA for the significant engagement with the various organisations representing people with disabilities, and their work on developing some sort of mechanism which will be of benefit for blind and partially sighted users, where they can actually be aware of the existence of one of these e-scooters. So that is, work that TIA has initiated and potentially will be internationally of benefit, not just from our local residents' point of view once that development takes place. So on that basis, I'm happy to approve this report and look forward to further developments in the future. Thank you. Yeah. I'll excuse you. So that then takes me on to item 6, which is the on page 33, consideration of results from a consultation with residents of Mount Vale Drive, Mount Vale Gardens and Towton Avenue in relation to some no waiting. Is this?
Yeah, this is me, yeah. So this report was brought forward after concerns were raised by the highway adoptions team and the developers of a new development just off Mount Vale Drive. The junction, potentially with parked vehicles in the area, would incur damage and doesn't seem suitable for a new junction to take that sort of damage. The proposal was put out for WL lines along Towton Avenue, Mount Vale Drive and Mount Vale Gardens. We received 1 objection to the report. They were based on their reasons for the objection were, sorry, 1 second. There was concerns about speed, with one side being completely open to traffic at all times. This similar situation has been in place during the construction to allow the construction traffic to get in, and we haven't had any reports of excessive speed during. About the Highways Act, the ability to enforce 9 meters from junction, could we not just consider that? We could, but it's not a priority for the North Yorkshire Police to take that. This gives us the power to be able to enforce the restrictions. And he also had another concern about why a speed hump wasn't included, but which was apparently in the planning. But when I checked with officers in the planning, there was only the hump inside the actual new development that was proposed. There was nothing on Mount Vale Drive. So the recommendations to take forward as advertised.
Thank you. Well, I have read the report, and as you said, it sounds as though from the point of view of safety and access, this is the most sensible way forward. You said that there's been restrictions in place whilst the construction.
Yeah, on a
in place.
temporary measure on
Yeah.
a wider section of the street as well,
Mhm.
and that hasn't increased it. Well,
And-
haven't had reports of any increased speed along there.
And has that construction completed now?
Yeah, all the properties have sold.
Okay, so I mean, on the basis of your assessment and the report, I'm happy to approve the recommended option for that, to approve that measure to be put in place. And obviously, if there are concerns about speeds and so on, that there is a process for addressing that, whether it's through us as a local authority or through the police. Okay. So I'm happy to approve that. So that takes me on to item 7, jumping ahead here. So item 7 is the report on, sorry, page 43, thank you. It's the report on signalised crossings technology. And I should just, particularly in the light of I mean, obviously the officers may want to reflect a little bit on the comments that have been made by public speakers, but I should just point out that this report is here for, at this stage, is here for me to note as a position statement rather than make a formal decision. We have established policy, which is what this is setting out, as I understand it. So do you want to?
Yes, that's right. We're not asking for a formal decision today. Indeed, what this paper does is set out a broad position. We do not, because of this report, have to only install near side signals. Indeed, because this is related to safety, which is obviously a very important issue, each installation, the decision we've made on a case-by-case basis based on many different factors. I thank the speakers for their input. There was a lot of technical input there. I do believe the specialist officers, the traffic signal engineers, the design team are aware of the information that was presented, including reference to PEDEX facilities and other very technical input. I believe that's been taken into account when creating this document, but I will check, I will confirm that that is the case. And yes, just to reiterate, this is a position that can be reconsidered on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions which I just think it'd be helpful just to clarify a few points that have been raised. Professor May made some reference to there being a distinction between crossings at junctions and standalone crossings. Are you aware of any sort of distinction in terms of the legislation or the guidance for that?
Yes, they work very differently. Is the simple answer to that. We're touching on a very technical issue. It's important because pedestrian crossing technology is obviously a critical safety feature. It's important that these decisions are made by experienced professionals based on guidance, legislation, and a lot of other factors. That's why we can't make a decision here to say we will only do X or Y in the future, because that wouldn't be appropriate. But what we're saying is this is our general preference, and again, it will be considered on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. Now, one of the speakers referred to I mean, again, it may be a technical question, but referred to the benefits for partially sighted people in particular of a far-sighted, the reassurance, if you like, of a far-sighted signal, and asking the question about whether there is on the market a design that would allow you to have both. Is that something which is done in other parts? I'm not aware of it, but whether that's something that's been looked at.
A pretty technical question, but I do believe I know the answer to that one. And I don't believe it's permitted to use both near side and far side signals.
Okay, so that's obviously one other sort of aspect to it. Also in your report, there was something which you said, that there's a provision or a facility for cancelling the crossing if there is nobody still waiting to be crossing it in effect, but we don't use that. Is that an option within the equipment? And if so, there's no reason given as to why we don't use that.
Yes, the way that technology is supposed to work is that it's got some motion sensors that see if there's anybody waiting to cross, and press the button. If that person wanders off, it can then cancel the crossing. It's to improve efficiency. The reason we don't use that technology is because despite working with the manufacturers on many occasions, we've never been able to get it to actually work properly.
So I suppose the concern would be whether somebody is standing very still may not be detected by it. Is that the issue, I suppose?
We found that it was not effective in detecting small children, users in wheelchairs,
right.
People who the technology couldn't detect particularly well. But fortunately, that part of the technology isn't necessarily a safety related feature. That's more about improving the efficiency of the junction.
There's the other question which a lot of people ask, and I know this may be down to awareness. There is a sensor which on the far side that detects someone on the crossing and in theory extends the time before the green signal comes on for the traffic. But because there's no far side signal, they've got no way of knowing whether that's working or not. So I suppose obviously each crossing the timing will vary according to the distance to be crossed, but to what extent does that extend the time? You know, how slow do you have to go before it will no longer let you hold up traffic?
So you're stretching the limits of my knowledge here, but I think what you're referring to is the on-crossing technology. That again is kind of a motion sensor that looks at when pedestrians are actually crossing the road, and it will hold off vehicles until they've fully crossed. A lot of users that are used to the far side signals, they see that green man as a bit of a reassurance. When it goes off, they think that the vehicles may be about to start, but with this near side technology and the on-crossing detectors, it holds off the traffic if there's somebody on the crossing within reason.
So, I mean, this obviously may vary between each junction, but is there a set period of time? Does it extend it by another 10 seconds, or does that vary again according to the junction we're looking at?
The amount of time it will extend it up to is part of the design process. The design engineers will choose that when they're creating the technology.
I'm just sort of anticipating, like, say, for example, I run an elderly person's establishment or something, and I want to know about that particular crossing and I want to try and reassure people, then that would be down to each individual junction will have potentially a different time.
Yeah, I would suggest it's perhaps not beneficial to tell people what the specific timings of the extensions need to be. It's more of a case of when they're designed, the extensions are built in such that even people that move particularly slowly will have sufficient time to cross. They just need to know that because they can't necessarily see a green man, that doesn't mean that the traffic is about to run them down.
I'm grateful for you bringing this report, and it certainly, I think, is something that will be revisited possibly as part of our overall local transport plan for Refresh, because certainly it is a key element for me in terms of promoting sustainable travel, namely walking being the one which is most accessible for everybody. You know, obviously walking or rolling, shall we say, is something which we want to encourage people to do. And I'm mindful of the fact that we've had quite a few representations that suggest this needs some further conversations and work. So I think it may well be something that could be looked at within the scope of our promoting a sustainable transport in local transport plan 4. I would also ask, I mean, as you said, if each junction is considered on its merits, I would certainly ask that we make sure that the Equalities Impact Assessment does consider the views of disabled users when we're actually making these changes to junctions, particularly, you know, what I understand that we've got a number of, from the report, you're saying that we're sort of 3/4 of the way through the process of replacing the far side with near side, which does mean that the majority may well already be standardised, but it does sound as though there's some issues to look at in terms of the user experience, whether that's based on reports from elsewhere in the country or from our own work, or voluntary groups like the Civic Trust. I do think we need to have a look at any particular junctions where that has been raised as a concern, just to whatever safety process you go through, whether we can actually respond to those concerns. And I'm not wanting to open the floodgates for lots of complaints about specific junctions, but it does seem as though a couple of junctions around the inner ring road have been specifically mentioned. So I think as part of our work on an accessible city centre and the crossing points on the inner ring road, maybe something that we need to have a closer look at. So I appreciate that I'm not in the position to make any decisions on this in terms of policy, but I would like to see some work done to both reassure residents who've raised concerns about particular junctions, and to see if there are any other technical solutions if we're not allowed to have far side and near side at the same time, whether there are other sort of design solutions that can address the problems that have been raised about people obscuring the sight lines to be able to see. I mean, I've experienced that myself, just being able to see even if you've got a higher level one, if you've got a significant number of people gathered around it. And I think the other question which was raised, inevitably where you have a longer cycle, which quite a lot of our junctions around the inner ring road, it's quite a long wait between the pedestrian phases, maybe 2.5, 3 minutes, which sounds like not very much, but it feels like a long time when you're waiting to cross the road, and people do take the opportunity to jump across if they can see a gap in the traffic, which could be a problem then for partially sighted people if they think that the lights have actually changed. So, again, those are sort of concerns that I think we do need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to address those. I don't think it needs any other points on that. So thank you very much for that report, and we'll move on to the next item then. So item 8 is the scope for the active travel programme. I don't know if is it Dave or James, who's leading on this one?
I think just as a quick introduction to this item, obviously what we are trying to do is make sure that we, before we instruct designers to design anything, before we go out and consult on the fine details of the projects, that we've got the scope of those projects correct. And obviously we've heard from a number of speakers that we haven't got that correct in one place. So that's the purpose of these reports, is to make sure that when we start spending money on designers, etc., that we tell them to do what it is you want them to do. So in essence, that's what this report is trying to get right. I don't know whether Dave or Christian want to address any of the particular points that have been raised.
Well, firstly, I sort of welcome the work that's gone into this. I think it's important to say that this programme has presented significant challenges getting underway after we secured the government funding a little bit over a year ago. But this paper does now reset the whole process with staff resource, focus and design teams in place to deliver a real step change for cycling on some of our key arterial routes in York. And with active travel England arriving here this summer, we will have expertise on hand to deliver quality infrastructure in spite of constraints of a historic city. I very much look forward to at last seeing delivery moving forward at pace. So I have got a number of specific points, as you've explained. The intention of this report was, somewhat ironically, it was to be more transparent about what is going on in terms of the programme. As I understand it from briefings from officers, at this stage of a scheme design, it would normally be something which officers give a brief direct to the designers, but we've actually introduced a more public-facing stage to that process, with the specific brief for a design being set out for formal approval at a public decision session. And although some of these project briefs may have existed previously, not in a sort of public form, the overall project outline and sort of indicative timetable was approved back in September, and this is now sort of moving those projects forward. Since we've got the staff in place, we've got the designers in place, so we're ready to move forward with those. And the intention was quite clearly to try, at my request, I hasten to add, to include ward councillors at an early stage, to give them the opportunity to help to inform the brief that's given to the designers, so that as far as possible we're able to streamline the sort of design and delivery process. Now, having said that, the actual scheme descriptions here, I have got a number of relatively minor additions to them, which I'll sort of run through, which were, if you like, they're more like just enhancements as much as anything to what's there, just to make it help with clarity. So if I can take them, and I'll leave the Acomb Road one till last, because I realise that's slightly more complex. But if I can take the rest of them in order, which we've got for the reports for. So the first one was the A19 scheme on page 67. And I did email this to Dave earlier on over the weekend, but I appreciate you've been on leave, so probably not necessarily had a chance to look at all of these. So first one was where it says improvement, and I can give you this, well, it's all, you've already got it if you need the actual wording, but okay, yeah. Well, I can, if you want, I'll make notes on this and hand it to Robert at the end if you want to make sure we got it accurate. Okay. So where it says improve the junction for cyclists, this is 67, where is it? Let's look at my notes. So there's on the top of page 67, I've just suggest adding without detriment to pedestrians. I appreciate that we're not looking to go out of our way to sort of do additional changes that are going to add to the cost, but I think it is important to say that we're wanting to improve the junctions for cyclists without making conditions for pedestrians any worse. So that relates to the and then there's the second point was where it says make changes to junctions at Clifton Green, Water End and Rawcliffe Lane, Shipton Road to improve the amenity for cycling. And I mean, I've got and where possible for walking, because this is supposed to be a walking and cycling scheme. So, you know, just wanting to add that where possible for walking, so that is looked at. Not saying it has to be there, but if that opportunity arises, we want to do that. The next point was where it says reduce speed limit. I believe that is referring to the section of the A19 which is currently 40 miles an hour. So I was just going to add in the word reduce the 40-mile-an-hour speed limit along a section of the A19. So that's just for a point of, again, for clarity.
Does that mean you would not wish to explore reduction of the 30-mile-an-hour zones?
I mean, I'm quite open on that, but I'm not sure that on a major, in terms of our current policy, we only do that outside schools or in particular locations rather than general reduction of the 20-mile-an-hour to 20-mile-an-hour limit.
I think in this case it might be better to leave it more open, despite what we've got in terms of, despite what our current policy is, because the result design might require a change in policy in a certain area. It might require an intervention. Okay. I'm not saying necessarily specifically on the A19, or I'm not pointing out any specific geography, okay, but I think generalising it a bit more might be a bit more helpful.
So basically what you're suggesting is it should reduce the 40 mile an hour or 30 mile an hour speed limit as appropriate. Is that absolutely what we're saying?
Yeah. I think what we're saying is at the moment it gives the team the scope to look at reducing speed limits wherever they think it would be helpful to achieve the objectives of the scheme. If it's the case that you would rather they only consider that in certain locations, then by all means narrow it down. But at present, it's giving the opportunity to consider any speed reductions that might be helpful.
I'm happy to leave it open. I just thought that was, I was trying to understand what you were seeking to have as an instruction. But yeah, so I'm in terms of minuting that, I'm quite happy to leave it as for reduce speed limits, plural, whatever the speed limit is, in a general sense. Okay. So then the next point on this one, or final point on the A19 was where it talks about safe pedestrian access to existing bus stops. I am aware that one particular, maybe more than one, but certainly one bus stop, there isn't actually space for a disabled user to get onto a bus from it. So what I was going to suggest was to add to enable safe pedestrian access to and use of bus stops, and then in brackets, including meeting needs of disabled passengers. I mean, as an authority, I would hope that we would do that as a matter of course if there is any work we're doing, look for opportunities to increase accessibility. So just wanted to add that wording in, so including meeting the needs of disabled passengers. And I appreciate that obviously, again, has budget implications potentially, but it's something we should be doing. So that's that one. The next one is the A1237 section of the River Ouse. So the only possible change I've got here was where it says in scope, it's got consideration of options which may cause a reduced traffic capacity. And I was going to add and reduced speeds on Great North Way close to the crossing points, because there's reference to crossing points, but however you want to phrase it, have something which is trying to address because I'm conscious that all councillors have raised concerns in that location about the fact that it's people are coming off, the outer ring road, 60 mile an hour road, and there's crossing points quite close to the arm of the roundabout.
Are you saying that the reducing speed limits is something that the team can consider as within scope to achieve the objectives, or you're asking for one of the fundamental objectives of the scheme to be to reduce speed limits?
Well, I'm asking for in scope to include measures to reduce speeds, and whether that's speed limits or, you know, physical changes to the layout or whatever it might be, hatch markings, it could be anything. Just so a general point about reducing speeds close to the crossing points of Great North Way. Yeah, okay. Well, that then takes me on to the next one I've got down was the north-south cycle route city centre. Find it. Which page are we on, Robert? Which now page 85 was over River Ouse. So
It's on page 89.
Page 89. Okay. So on this one, a sort of a general point. I mean, I'm quite easy to, very flexible on the wording, but I think in terms of the project description and objectives, I think it needs to say something. Wording I've got here is that one of the objectives is more than simply addressing safety issues. It's about trying to create a clear, legible and attractive route, alternative route for cyclists rather than either the foot streets or the inner ring road, because that is basically what it is. It's about creating, and that was why it was put forward as an active travel scheme rather than a safety scheme, was to create a legible 24/7 route that, you know, is available whether it's in foot street hours or not, and that cyclists can use to get from one part of the city to another. So that's a sort of a general point under probably objectives or project description, if that's okay. And then there is a more specific point that relates to the Oglethorpe Goodrham Gate junction is described as being out of scope, and I'd like to change that. It's down as being out of scope as part of a ward-funded scheme, but I have a representation from Councillor Cracker, which has been sort of emailed to you as well, pointing out that the scheme has come about trying, as ward councillors, wanting to try and improve disability access, and the fact that we have a programme of enhancing disability access within the city centre. This clearly needs to be part of that, but it also happens to be on the active travel route. So what I'm asking for is to change that into being, if you like, one of the sort of related, there's a section of the report that talks about, what is it? Dependencies and related works. It would probably be more appropriate for it to go into there as something which we can progress as a holistic scheme. If there's ward funding which is being contributed towards it, that's fine, but I understand the latest cost estimate may well be that it's outside of the scope of what they can afford anyhow, which will mean that it has to be part of the city centre access.
On the active travel scheme,
Mm-hmm.
we'll put it out of scope as written.
Right.
But we'll put it as a dependency in the dependency related works. It's
Okay.
because that as a ward scheme is more advanced and is funded separately than the north-south cycle scheme.
So, well, I mean, obviously separate outside of this meeting, the question of whether it's ward funded or city centre access funded, which again is separate from this report.
True.
But I think that obviously needs to be looked at.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't. The only other point I would want to make is that there is an element of the active travel route which does need to be considered at that junction. What I've written here, you can sort of do with this what you want in terms of exactly how it's phrased, but I suggested to add in scope LTM 120 scoring to be applied to that junction to achieve as close to green as possible for right turning movements from Goodram Gate into Old Walk. So, you know, the physical structure in terms of a table for level access for disabilities is one project. In terms of active travel scheme, we need to look at it in terms of signing priorities, the hierarchy of road users, those sorts of aspects as part of this route still need to be considered. But the actual, the issue about disabled access wouldn't be in scope for this project. Does that make sense?
Does that
an approach?
We have in there at present consideration of LTN 120. Green scoring solutions are preferred. Non-green scoring solutions can be considered if they achieve the stated objectives. Is that sufficient?
And this would be brought forward to you again as a proposal once the designs were worked up. I think the thing
maybe just rather than take it as a specific one, but perhaps maybe with that reference you could say, for example, this particular location, because I think
we can put brackets
when you actually look at the geography of the route, there are probably about 3 points where the route crosses a more major road, and obviously that will apply. Some of them are more or less a straight across movement. With this one, it is actually a right turn, which is going to be more of an issue. And the whole purpose of the scheme is to make it more attractive for cycling, to actually create that consistent level of confidence for people who are using it. Is that?
So just to clarify then, we've got a line which is about 6 lines down, which is the consideration of the LTM 120. And what we'll do in brackets after that is just put e.g. the Old Walk Oglethorpe
Junction.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think we would consider it anyway, but we'll highlight that.
Yeah. And I think, I can't remember, but in scope there is consideration of sort of different priorities, or encouraging lower speeds and things like that, isn't there? So obviously a table that has 2 benefits. One is for pedestrians wanting to cross from one side to the other, but it also has a traffic calming benefit.
I think in terms of practicalities, what we'll do as best we can is try and work the 2 pieces of work in parallel.
Yeah.
So we won't consider creating a raised table at that junction as part of the active travel scheme. Yeah. But it'll be considered as part of the ward scheme. Although I do know that there are challenges with doing that, which you've obviously had presented, we've discussed, and we're looking for alternative things for. So that's a separate piece of work, but we're happy to proceed if that's your thing.
Yes, I mean, I am conscious of the fact that city centre accessibility is a key priority, and hopefully want that to be progressing quickly as well. So yes. That would dovetail with this and try and work the 2 together.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for that. The next one I've got is city centre bridges. City centre bridges. Just so it's sort of implied, but where it says in scope, we've got consideration of solutions that require changes to traffic regulation orders. I don't know whether you need to specifically mention including lower speed limits. Obviously, that is a traffic regulation order, but that I think would be something that could be looked at. I think from experience of the city centre bridges, the issue about close pass is more of an issue out when it's not congested. Obviously, when it's congested, vehicles are not moving very much. And when it's not congested, then the speed is the issue, which would be of concern. And a second point, which is quite topical with the changes to the highway code, consideration of advisory signs. I've seen, I don't know quite what it's, whether it's got a TSRG code, but there's signs have been used. They are oblong blue with a car passing a cycle with a 1.5 metre width. You know, something along those lines could be looked at. Obviously, I'm not specifying that, but what I'm saying is advisory signs that remind people, because the reason this is on the list was about concerns about close passing and the fact that we haven't got cycle lanes on the bridges, or very narrow cycle lanes on the bridges. So that was just another one which could be added as a for consideration.
You've got one now about signage solutions.
Okay.
Lines up.
Okay, well, so maybe you could just put example.
But I think we're just. Sorry. I think we've got signage solutions. I'm loath to give designers too much detail, but I think we can add speed limits to the penultimate in scope around traffic regulation orders, review of speed.
Thank you. And then this one, maybe one which does relate to on dependencies and related works. I think need to add city centre bus study, because that's not referenced but is taking place, sort of bus routes within the city centre, and may or may not be relevant but needs to be referenced. And then linked to that would be where it says consideration of solutions that impacts loading. I was going to add stroke bus stop arrangements where needed. I mean, not looking to move bus stops around if we don't, but that may be something that needs to be looked at, considered.
The only thing I would say is if you add the bus study as a dependency, this then sits there and waits until that piece of work is complete.
Right.
Which I don't think is what you really want to achieve. So my advice is, yes, we need to be mindful of it, but I don't think you mean it to be a dependency. Right.
I mean, obviously, I'm just following the English language, not necessarily the technical processes that you follow. But I think
it means it depends on it. It doesn't depend on it. It's
okay. Well, I'm happy to leave it out as a dependency, but I've flagged it up as something which might have some impact on this. Okay. So then I'll move on next. The next one I've got is Hospital Fields Road. And again, this might come into the same category, I suppose. There is the Ordnance Lane housing development, which has a focus on active travel and low car ownership, which is likely to develop within the next 2 years, and may or may not be something which is relevant in terms of section 106, but I wouldn't want to hold work back in terms of, I think actually it's worth saying that there is already a planning application in for that, but it obviously hasn't been determined as yet. So I'll take your advice on whether we specifically make reference to that development, but it is another, if you like, another rationale that the developers might want to take account of, thinking about 85 new households that could be accessing a route or alongside the route.
Yeah, I think we are aware of that. The team are aware of that. But again, to reiterate James's point, I don't think we need to wait for that to come to a conclusion before doing this piece. It's not directly dependent upon it.
Thank you. So again, that's just noting then. Again, next one, Fishgate Gyratory Pedestrian and Cycle Scheme. I'm aware that some work is already underway with one of the designers looking at this project. So, I don't know, it may well be that this is on the list for the sake of completeness, but some work is already underway for that. But there's no, so what I was just wanting to make sure is that work I'm aware of that they're looking at is included within here. in particular the pedestrian crossing route at the A junction of Cemetery Road and Fulford Road, which is something that I understand they are looking at. As a ward councillor, I've been discussing that with some officers, so I'm aware that that work is underway, but it's not referred to in this document.
So if any of these do represent a change to the work that has been commissioned with the design resource, we'd have to engage with them to understand the implications of that. For example, I think you've got down here that you would like this project to consider extending the 20-mile-an-hour zone in that area. I don't believe that's currently something the design team, the project team are looking at. So that could, if we're to change this scope, that could have some implications, and we might have to come back to you to inform you of what those are.
Yeah, I haven't got to that point, but yeah, that I'm aware that the extent, the geographic extent of this scheme runs from Cemetery Road Junction to Fishergate Bar, and part of the remit, as it says, is about trying to improve the connectivity between the two cycle schemes, between cycle routes on Fulford Road and the routes within the bar. So that was why I sort of included that. But I mean, if there are some points that come out here that need to be fed into work that's already underway, you know, that's fine. But just wanting to understand.
Indeed, if we can incorporate these into the work that's underway, we will do that. If there are any implications, we'll identify those.
Is that fair? Yeah. All right, I'm happy with that. Thank you. Next one I've got is St George's Field crossing. I mean, this might be already implicit in what you've written, but from all the discussions have been over this particular facility, I thought it should be important to include wording that says in scope, consideration of a desire to create a single stage super crossing to link the new walking and cycling route over the new bridge over River Foss and onto Piccadilly. So, although it's not, it is the main reason this is in the Castle Gateway project, which is actually referred to in the related projects, is because it's that link, and it's an attractive route for walking and cycling into the city centre from St George's Field and the Riverside Path. So I just thought that should be spelt out in some way. So it's adding in the word consideration, if you like, for that.
Okay, so a single stage supercrossing can be considered, but you're not specifically requesting or
just
specifying that it has to be a single stage crossing.
Yes, it's just saying that needs to be considered as what was expressed as the most desirable option. And I think, in fact, if I'm right, the funding for this particular piece of work has been switched around to make it greater flexibility for us, allow us to do that in terms of government criteria for sustainable travel schemes.
So you would still consider an option if the team presented a solution that wasn't a single stage crossing?
I think we'd still consider it, but I think having gone to the trouble of changing the funding arrangements, it seems to make sense to maximise the attractiveness as a sustainable transport route. And I'm aware that if it's not a single stage crossing, then it means that significant challenges in terms of a sheep pen, for want of a better word, in the middle of the road for pedestrians and cycles.
Yeah, without obviously going into too much detail, it's useful to give the design team options. Yeah. If, for example, a single stage crossing simply isn't feasible due to the distance, that means we have no viable options. But if it's consideration of, we can absolutely do that.
Thank you. And then just a couple more. Rouget Street, Tanner's Moat. I know this is something, I think this is one of the schemes that was originally flagged up in July 2019. I just thought it might be helpful to add into the scope. I think it's possibly implicit in what wording you've got, but achieving unobstructed access for cyclists and wheelchair users with a review of the location of curbs, drop curbs and vehicle obstructions. Because the issue we've got at this particular junction is it's very busy corner for pedestrians. It's also got quite a sharp turning for cyclists. And you've got the risk of vehicles, whether legally or illegally parking, blocking access to and from either the gap for the cyclists or the footway for people in wheelchairs. So I think that was one of the issues, was trying to ensure that it's accessible for wheelchair users as well as people in all different shapes and sizes of bicycles. It's quite a challenging corner, which is probably why it's an issue which people have raised in the past.
I think we have this reflected in the objective, unless I'm misunderstanding the. It's to improve the amenity for pedestrians, cyclists, and wheelchair/mobility scooter users of that particular location at the cycle gap.
I mean, maybe it's implicit in that, but I think one of the concerns that has been raised with me was wheelchair access to and from the footway to the road, because you know, if the footpath itself in front of the business premises gets blocked for whatever reason with loading and so on, they want to be able to go from the footway into the road or vice versa, and not just expected to stay on the footway and only crossing at the point.
Yeah, I think we've had some customers specifically requesting a dropped curb so they can get from the footpath onto the carriageway. That's
as long as that's covered, I'm happy with that.
As in, you would like us? Okay.
If you've noted that, then that's fine. And then I've got Skeldergate. Could you clarify? I understood that there was a ward scheme more or less on this theme. I don't know whether it's a different theme or the same theme, which ward councillors have quite recently said they're wanting to progress.
My understanding is that the ward scheme is, my recollection is that the ward scheme is about reducing vibration from the speed cushions to nearby buildings, whereas this has a different objective.
Okay. So what I was going to add in terms of scope was to consider the needs of adapted cycles, trikes in relation to traffic calming measures. So, you know, I appreciate that tables are more effective when you've got buses, if you want to slow down the speed of buses, but then if you've got a cycle bypass, which I think is one of the options that's been looked at here, that needs to cater for wider cycles, you know, adapted bikes and cargo bikes and things like that, as well as conventional bikes. I mean, I would hope that would be in scope in any scheme, to be honest, but you know, I thought it was worth in that particular location, if we're talking about a sort of bypass at the conflict point for cycles going in the opposite direction.
I'm not sure we're referring to a bypass anywhere.
I mean, I don't know, obviously this is a project outline, isn't it? So we don't know exactly what the specific
design
measures are.
resource
To reduce conflict between cycles and other road users, if I remember rightly.
A cycle bypass may indeed be one of the options that presented. I don't believe the design team have created any options on this one yet.
Okay.
But in answer to your request, generally, well, yes, consideration of all types of cyclists are considered when designing cycling infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. And then just to say the Wheldrake to Heslington scheme, I appreciate that that's quite a complex, well, there seem to be a number of different options presented, mainly because of the issue about land ownership, but just wanted some assurance that whatever negotiations or conversations are needed to progress those would be, if you like, in scope. That, you know, I think it does make some reference to land ownership, but I think it is important to say that, you know, this is one of the schemes that we put forward for the active travel programme, particularly because of it being of critical value for residents in Wheldrake and that area, but equally for residents of a city who want to go out into countryside and feel intimidated to getting across major busy roads. So, you know, it's something we want to see progress, but accept that there is slightly more significant work to do, but that means it may take longer to achieve.
Yes, you'll have seen that some of the projects don't consider land ownership issues, but the Wheldrake to Heslington scheme explicitly does, and we have already started to engage with landowners in that area to understand what obstacles we'll have to overcome to get a solution in place.
Okay, thank you for that. So now I'll come back now. I think that concludes all of the ones other than Acomb Road, and apologise if people are waiting to hear this particular project. I think in terms of answering some of the questions that were raised, the process that we went through was, as has been said, was to try to understand the local geography. I organised Zoom meetings with the ward councillors for all of the wards affected by this scheme, and at the end of that process, the intention was to reflect that in the project outlines that we have before us. So I don't know if the officers want to sort of come in and just sort of reflect a little bit on where we've got to with this. Do you want to?
Insofar as how
insofar as how the geographical, yeah, particularly the geographic extent.
It was off after your steer, after the discussions with the ward councillors.
Okay. So as has been said, the discussion was had with the ward councillors, and I think, as has been said, there was some concern expressed in those meetings from the Westfield councillors that this maybe didn't relate sufficiently to the regeneration programme. But I suppose what I would find helpful, I'm sure other people who made representations would find helpful, is to know a little bit more about the Westfield regeneration scheme. I appreciate that, you know, there has already been a consultation about that. I've seen some press coverage about the regeneration scheme, but I don't know if officers could just give a little bit more about what, you know, understanding of the timescale for that and what it consists of, what it doesn't consist of.
It's not a transport-led scheme, so whilst we've shared this brief, sorry. So it's not a transport-led scheme, so I can't address your direct concerns, but I have shared the brief with the officer in the regeneration team who is leading on this. So if we wanted to put some narrative in that the design needed to be developed in consultation with that regeneration scheme, that would be fine, because we've already sort of started to do that. I think what we do need to determine is the scope and extent, because that is what ultimately will be given to a designer.
Well, as you can gather, I've had a significant number of representations on this item, and I have forwarded most of them to, I think, forwarded them to Robert, and some of them, so I haven't sent all of them to you because some of them were sort of standard representations, but from memory, I think I've had 16 emails specifically expressing concerns about the published proposal, and in the light of those proposals, what I would suggest that we do is, and again, I can take officers' advice in terms of whether this is sufficiently clear for publication, is to change the actual scope of the proposal to where it says, so I've got what project description and aims, and I think it's referred to in a number of other places. So where it refers to facilities for cyclists between Hebden Rise and the Fox Junction, to change that to say between Beckfield Lane and the Fox Junction, but under the dependencies and related works, and again, take your advice on this, to include reference to the Acomb regeneration scheme. So not saying that this couldn't be taken forward until that is in place, but nevertheless that whatever comes forward would need to be developed in consultation with officers who are working on that, but also very clearly with ward councillors and all stakeholders. And that would mean that out of scope would have to remove the section where it says work west of Hebden Rise is not included, and replace that with a wording which gives some indication that work west of Hebden Rise may need to be considered as a second phase in conjunction with the Acomb regeneration scheme. So what I'm asking, I suppose what I'm asking for is for the whole corridor to be in scope for design, but as was planned all along, for detailed consultation, which comes forward once that design has been prepared, would quite clearly include a sort of a separate look at the section to the west and how that relates to the concerns of businesses, any other stakeholders, and the regeneration scheme. So that would be quite explicit, separate consultation on that part of the scheme.
So in terms of the brief, the designers, it's the whole lot. We'll bring it back, we'll consult on that as a whole lot. We'll then bring it back to you and say, here's a design for the whole lot, here are the comments, and here's how it relates to the regeneration scheme. How do you want to split up the phasing of that, so that we'll look at how this can be delivered in phases potentially?
That sounds to make sense to me. I mean, I think certainly a lot of the representations that you've heard have been about the coherence and the developing a whole scheme. But I think just to reflect on the thinking behind the original paper to split it was acknowledging the fact that there are more significant challenges in terms of achieving a scheme which meets the aspirations for high quality segregated routes to the west of Hebden Rise. So from the point of view of creating a vision of what we want to achieve as a consistent whole, I think it does make sense for designers to be given the brief to develop the whole scheme, but then at that point it will be then, well, I mean, in any case, whichever ward it is, there will be consultation for the whole scheme, but there would be some explicit need to address concerns that might be around the impact on businesses and how the sort of needs of Acomb shops and that whole area can be accommodated within the scheme. So I think the fact that we've gone through this process obviously will help to flag up to the designers that there potentially are greater sensitivities that need to be addressed in how it is designed to address those sorts of issues. Does that make sense? Everyone's happy with that as a proposal. So
I think just there was a mention of schools that potentially missing from the scope. I don't know whether you wanted to specifically
yes, I
add
suppose
those.
if there are any points that have been raised by the public speakers you want to come back on, that would be helpful.
So there were 2 schools mentioned that weren't specifically mentioned in the scope. So I think what we'll do is we'll just talk about schools more generally in the scope. Schools in there.
I think, I mean, in terms of schools, obviously, primary schools tend to have a smaller catchment than secondary schools. Secondary schools may well draw people from further afield, so that could be potentially an issue to look at.
So what we've not done in these documents is put any great detail into the consultation process. And there's absolutely no reason why we wouldn't engage with a fairly significant area for a scheme of this size. I would absolutely expect the schools to be part of the consultation process when we get to that stage.
Yeah, okay. So on that basis, I'm happy to approve and apologise for the number of amendments that these reports were, as you'll be aware, they were prepared in quite a short timescale because we want to avoid any delays beyond where we are now. So, I was keen to get this moving forward as quickly as possible, but I think some of the sort of relatively minor changes hopefully will clarify some of the points that will lead to a better quality scheme that we can then take to consult on. And I'm aware, as I said at the start of the meeting, that Active Travel England are going to be based in York, and one would hope that they will have very good object lessons in the challenges that we face in terms of delivering quality cycle schemes.
I just wanted to add that it was discussed by a couple of the public speakers about engagement with Active Travel England, and we're already, as officers, engagement with their officers in terms of the initial phases of them coming in, how we can work together, what they can add in terms of quality schemes and things like that.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So in terms of the recommendations, I'm aware that one or two slight changes. Obviously, under the project scope outlines, I think what I've done is gone for option B, but with a variation. Paragraph 30 suggests that any changes would have to come back to another decision session. I don't think we need to delay things for that. Having said that, of course, if there are any particular challenges that arise from those changes, then an individual project could come back. But if it helps, I'm quite happy to delegate to the director and myself to make any particular changes that might be needed. Is that sort of an appropriate way to deal with that, do you think?
Sorry, thank you, Dave. I think there's a bit about transparency of this. So we could absolutely say that further changes after today's session would be delegated to myself in consultation with you, or could come to a decision session if they were more significant. The changes that you've made today, I do think it probably helps for them to be visible. So what I think we'll do is probably between ourselves and Robert, we'll try and capture those and list them out so that they can actually be in a separate annex of with these
So there'll be in the
changes.
decision notice from this meeting,
Yeah,
effectively.
so that actually everyone can
I'm
see
happy with
exactly
that. I just
what
wanted to clarify that point because it's slightly different from what's in the report. The other elements of the report, I don't know if you need to say anything about the project prioritisation and the procurement process. There's a list on page 57 of the prioritisation, which I think in part reflects it reflects availability of design or stages that we've already got to with design of a group, the project teams, doesn't it? If we want to say something about that, because some people have asked, well, why is this here and why is this one at a different stage in terms of priorities?
Yes, the way it's represented here is to try not to bog the report down with lots of irrelevant information as to teams are consisting of these people, etc., etc. This is a shorthand way of describing how we're assigning the resource, basically. But the individual prioritization is very much for yourself to decide, Councillor, and I believe what we've presented here is our understanding of your preferences with regards to prioritization.
And I would also just want to clarify, given the item that we've talked about, I think I've enlarged it, even my eyesight wasn't good enough to be able to read the chart that you've got on the timetable. But from looking at the timetable, Acomb Road has not got dates in, but it's all down as TBC. So if we can update that now, reflecting the decision that's been taken today, so that the next time this report comes back to me, when alongside the financial monitor reports,
I think we'll update this. It'll also, once we've done that procurement exercise, we'll have more knowledge about that as well.
Yeah, the next step after this decision has been made is to engage in that procurement process, get that resource on board, start to understand how long that's going to take, and we can, as we work through the process, refine the timescales and provide more accurate information.
You have just one reminder, one other point, if you could just clarify. I have been asked about there's some figures in the report identifying costs for procurement when we previously had designs for some of these. Can you explain why we're paying out for design when we've already got designs?
On the Acomb Road scheme specifically?
Don't think it was Acomb Road, it was the A19 actually, but
on the A19 scheme,
we did. Well, certainly I
think we
had a
may
look
have
at the scheme in about a year ago. Was discussed. And
yeah, I think we may have reported this at a previous Capital Monitor report, but the A19 scheme did previously have some preliminary design resource in place that withdrew. So we've had to attempt to obtain another principal designer.
Okay. So, and we have now got a principal design team in place covering, well, I think they're identified in the report, aren't they? Some have got design teams in place and some haven't.
Indeed, it's each project is at a different stage of progress. For the A19 scheme, I believe we have a contract ready to go pending this decision session to proceed.
So I would like also just to take this opportunity to give an indication that in order to move forward with these schemes as efficiently as possible, I do want to make sure that all councillors are aware at each stage, and the consultation process is as transparent as possible. And, I suppose in a way, apology for some confusion that has arisen in the status of this report. I think that certainly from some of the comments, it did appear that there was a feeling that we were at a later stage with these, that we're sort of signing off something without people even seeing the design. Obviously, this is a preliminary briefing for the designers to work up a design, which will then go to wider public consultation. whereas some of the comments have suggested that that consultation had been short-circuited and hadn't taken place, if you see what I mean. So I think we do need to be as transparent as possible of what stage we're at and what will happen next. So just by way of reassurance, once the detailed designs have been produced, they will be open for public consultation with all relevant stakeholders and more councillors before the actual decision to construct is approved. So on that basis, then I'm happy to approve the recommendations with the amendments that I have referred to, and with the note that has just been pointed out that there will be a sort of fairly detailed breakdown in the report from this meeting what has been decided. But if there are minor changes that need to be taken after this in terms of scope, we can do that as on a delegated basis, just so that we don't have to hold up the whole programme for another month or 6 weeks to get another decision. Is that clear to people? Thank you. My agenda. So I think just clarity, I do feel we need to ensure that the scheme ties in with other things happening in the area, or it applies to any of the schemes really, but that shouldn't prevent the initial design for the full route going ahead in Acomb. And both sections are now in scope, with the western section dovetailing in, as part of the whole programme. On that basis, I don't think I have any urgent business. In which case, at 5 o'clock, I will draw the meeting to a close. And apologies for the length of time we've taken, but hopefully we